Welcome everyone to another fun episode of Indie Reads Aloud. I love having this author in the program. She has turned into be one of my bestest friends in the author community. This is SW Raine, but I call her Raine because she's a friend. And Raine is you are the only author I know personally who writes steampunk.
There's
This
not a
is
lot of people.
it's such a really specific genre, and I think it's a challenging genre for a lot of writers because there are specific rules about it.
Yeah, depending on when it's set.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, but it's a super fun genre too because you get to play with this mix of history and speculative fiction, which is a really fun like pile of stuff to play around in.
And you get to make up the technology that already exists, but make it steam powered. It's so fun.
And you get to use it in ways that most people wouldn't think about using that technology, which is
Yes.
super cool. Um, I have an author friend who writes steampunk, and she uses a lot of nanotechnology, but it's all steampunk-esque nanotechnology, which is just such a wild idea.
It is.
But she writes in short stories. She doesn't write like full-length novels. So you're the only person I know who writes real like and the book you're going to be reading from today is book one of a series.
Yes.
So this is The Rise of the Sky Pirate, which is book one of the adventures of Captain Keenan. Um, I need to stop here for just a second because already I'm so happy to have you on the program that I forgot to remind everybody that there is a listener advisory for this episode for violence, strong language, and some mature situations. So if you have little ears, this might be the time to pause the program and preview it before you let your little ear people in on this episode. So, but I tend to get too excited to have you here that I forget. So, for
I'm
those of you
excited to be here.
for those of you who don't know Raine, she is Canadian, born and raised, and constantly moved between Ontario and Quebec with her military family. She moved to Michigan in 2004, where she currently lives with her husband and young son, who is just an astounding human being. I mean, not to say that your husband's not an astounding human being, but your son's pretty astounding,
He
gotta
is.
say. She has always had a vivid imagination and loved reading and writing from a very young age. She took courses in children's literature through ICL in Illinois and published her debut novel, Adult Steampunk Adventure, in 2020. She has participated in NaNoWriMo for 18 years. Is that
This is
right?
going to be my 18th year.
It's crazy. And was a municipal liaison for the Detroit region for 6 years. And you've won all but one of those participating years, right?
Yes. All but my fifth year.
Okay, so I know I've asked you this question before, but I'm gonna nag you about it again. Out of all of those years of Nano, we only have 3 novels. Where the heck are the rest of them?
They're still in draft mode.
Of course they are.
Yeah. The Techno Mage was actually my 2012 novel. And I want to say that, yes, it was actually my 2012 novel. And The Elemental's Guardian, my urban fantasy, was my 2011 novel.
So you're just writing them and finishing them eventually.
I mean, I do finish them. I'm a bare bones drafter, so I can pretty much like bare bones up to 50,000 words. And
Yeah,
then basically what I'm doing, because I've grown as an author,
of course. We always do.
yes, when I read back those old drafts, they are horrendous. So the first thing that I have to do is I have to do a complete rewrite.
And make them acceptable
Oh my
for
goodness,
your
yes.
now standard of writing ability, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, like the Techno Mage had a complete rewrite. The Elemental's Guardian had a complete rewrite. I'm currently editing part 2, which also had a complete rewrite. And for this Nano, I will be rewriting part 3 of
You
that
rebel,
trilogy.
you.
I know, but I mean, it's a complete rewrite, so in all technicality, it's like writing a whole new novel.
Well, yeah, it kind of is. In this way, you pantser get to be a plotter because you're actually taking a story that exists and reframing it. So you're essentially starting with an outline and
Yes, because I do have to, basically what I do after I pants the whole thing is I do what's called a reverse outline. So
okay.
yes, I am starting technically with an outline, but an outline of something I already pantsed first.
Yeah, you people are weird. I am super excited to hear you read this book. I just love your style and I love your characters, and I think Benedict Keenan is just such a great character. I mean, it's just
I
he's so
absolutely
much
love
fun.
him. He
He's so
came
much fun.
originally from the Techno Mage. He was a side character. His sole purpose was to get the characters from point A to point B. And then I made the mistake in naming him because I couldn't keep calling him the captain.
Yeah.
And then he took on a life of his own, and I needed to find out, I fell in love with him, and I needed to find out how he became that Sky Pirate captain.
And that's kind of fun because this is book one in the series, which is actually the second book in the series that you wrote. So
Technically, it's a spin-off.
It's a flashback existence,
Yes.
but it chronologically it comes first.
Yes, it's
Yeah.
set 15 years prior to the events of the Techno Mage.
Super fun stuff. I can't wait to hear you read this. When you are ready, please take the microphone and read aloud.
All right, so this is going to be chapter 12, just a little setting. Benedict Keenan is on his way to Canada for a rogue job, which pays a lot of money. And they find a ship that has been attacked by sky pirates and a sole survivor, which is a surgeon by the name of Matthias. A shout startled him awake. Benedict's eyes blew wide, searching for the source. He saw nothing but darkness before a loud explosion rocked his surroundings. Where was he? What was going on? Sailors leaped from their hammocks and rushed to put out the flames as best they could via the portholes as McGee made his way to the gun deck roaring orders. It took Benedict a moment to regain clarity amid the chaos. It was nighttime, he was aboard the Nine, and they were under attack. Gritting his teeth against the lingering soreness of his muscles, Benedict flipped out of his hammock and dashed for the stairs. Had the ones responsible for destroying the sweepstake returned? If his suspicions were correct, then the assailants were after his reward, the surgeon. The main deck was a mess of scattered debris and burning fires amid sword clashes and gunshots. Swiftly glancing about to assess the situation, he spotted 3 small floating wooden brigantines tethered to the Nine and hissed his displeasure, the telltale sign of sky pirates. Ducking and shielding himself from flying wreckage as an enormous explosion boomed overhead, Benedict watched as a body hit the deck, impaled by a thick fragment of rusty steel. The ship would not last much longer. Snatching the gun that slid near his bare feet, he shot to disarm, but did not quite hit as many pirates as he would have liked. Guns were definitely not his specialty. Growling in annoyance, his attention darted to the stairs to the balloon above, where the quartermaster fended off the enemy. Rushing toward them all, Benedict fired, hitting one pirate in the shoulder and another in the back, while Erickson slashed out at the third attacker with his sword and kicked them into the fourth. "Where's the surgeon?" he demanded as he approached the quartermaster. Erickson nodded his head in the direction of the captain's quarters. "With the captain." Benedict heard the approaching shout at the same time as he saw Erickson's gaze shift and harden. Spinning around, he pulled the trigger, resulting in a point-blank shot into the oncoming pirate's chest. Dread washed over him as the body hit the deck, unmoving. Suddenly envisioning himself imprisoned in Coldbath Fields prison, his thoughts traveled to poor Kitch and the disappointment upon her features during each of her visits. Another explosion nearby broke him from his shock. He didn't have time to think about that. He had to protect his reward. Turning back to the quartermaster, his eyes fell on the stairs as he spoke. "Let me up." For once, Erickson did not argue and stepped aside. Rushing up and into the balloon, Benedict skidded to a halt, his eyes widening as he came face to face with a sharp and rusty blade. Still tightly gripping his gun, his hands flew innocently to his sides. to the sides of his head as he tried to convince Bailey that he was not the enemy. It's me, he said, taking a step back. The doctor glared, looking so much fiercer without his multi-lensed goggles upon his head. Pushing the blade away from his face, Benedict rushed past the doctor to the captain's closed door, pounding loudly. Captain, it's Ben. Within seconds, Captain Allendale opened the door and looked at Benedict before casting a quick glance over in Bailey's direction. He nervously scratched his scalp, motioning for Benedict to enter with a cock of his head before slamming the door shut behind him once he was fully inside. Report, he asked, passing his sleeping quarters and heading straight for the helm. Benedict followed until they stopped inside the cramped cabin room. Levers vibrated from the balloon's acoustics, and buttons blinked the problems on deck, emphasized by the steaming pressure gauges, revealing trembling dial needles beyond their danger zones. 3 ships are tethered, and Commander Erickson is fending them off at the bottom, he said. They seem to be pirates. You would be correct. The captain glanced over his shoulder at the surgeon. Are they here for you? Benedict asked Matthias, who watched them both from the captain's cushioned chair. An explosion shattered the windows in the cabin, just as Matthias parted his lips to answer. Ducking and shielding their heads from the glass, Captain Allendale growled as he stood back up. Stay here and keep an eye on him, Mr. Keenan, he ordered, pulling his gun from his holster. I need to protect my ship. Benedict nodded as the captain left, then turned his attention back to Matthias, who nervously fidgeted with the item in his pocket while staring toward the door. He hoped the captain could turn the tide of this fight because he wasn't sure how much more the 9 could handle before crumbling beneath their feet. And when he heard Bailey's battle cry at the sound of steel against steel, his stomach dropped. Their chance of escape was getting slimmer by the second. Remaining in the captain's cabin was a death sentence, and he'd be damned if he'd break his promise to Kitch. Glancing about for something, anything, his attention paused at the windows. Holstering the gun, he reached for the surgeon's arm and pulled him out of the chair. I know the captain said to stay here, but... Jumping atop the console, he climbed out the window and grabbed the rope above his head that fed through multiple retainer rings along the outside of the rigid balloon. Hope you're okay with heights, he added, holding out his free hand for Matthias to take. Despite the chaos on deck beneath him, he heard the hollow thuds against the door separating the attackers from the captain's cabin. It wouldn't be long before the door burst open and pirates would flood in. He had to reach the ladder. If he could climb to the top of the rigid balloon, he'd have some semblance of an advantage. Or so he hoped. Come on, he urged. Matthias jumped, startled, tearing his attention away from the oncoming calamity to scramble up the console toward the window. Benedict grasped his hand just as the door blew off its hinges. Grab the rope and walk along the rim. Hurry, follow me. Eyes on the ladder, he shuffled uncomfortably along the lip that was so narrow he could barely rest on the balls of his bare feet. Knuckles white from his death grip on the rope, he clenched his jaw shut so tightly it hurt. Carefully, he made his way along the edge of the balloon, glad that his muscles had stopped screaming now that adrenaline had kicked in. A gasp escaped the surgeon, and Benedict turned his head to see the man's fearful gaze upon the battle on deck. Don't look down, he snapped, and Matthias was quick to clamp his eyes shut. Quickly, this way. The steel rungs within reach, Benedict grabbed hold and pulled himself onto the safety rail. Upon turning to Matthias, a feeling of dread washed over him as his attention focused past the surgeon. He even let a very unnoble curse slide past his clenched teeth. What's wrong? Matthias asked, eyes wide in fear. The pirates were following them, climbing along the rim toward the ladder. Time was of the essence. Brows furrowed in determination, Benedict began climbing. He just had to reach the top. Come on, he called out after Matthias. Follow me. Their attackers rapidly catching up, Benedict urged Matthias to move a little faster. Once at the top of the balloon, he dropped to his knees and reached down for the surgeon, grabbing him by the wrists and hauling him to the top. Removing the gun from his holster, he pulled the trigger and shot at the first pirate, who fell from a blow to the shoulder, knocking some others down along with him. Jumping to his feet, he rushed to the next closest safety rail of the 6, only to find the enemy climbing that one as well. A dash to the next ladder revealed they were surrounded. Ben, there was a concerned quiver in the surgeon's voice. Benedict spun around, his eyes hard on the approaching pirates that had finally reached the top, brandishing their weapons menacingly. Great. There was no time to form a plan, not that there was much of a plan to begin with, surrounded at the very top of a doomed airship. Gritting his teeth as the enemy advanced, he took aim and lunged forward as Matthias dropped to his knees in the middle of the balloon, covering his head with his arms. Benedict fired 3 times before one bullet finally hit, collapsing a heavier-set balding man. Ducking down next to Matthias, he swiped the drop sword and stuck his arm forward defensively, stabbing a freckled marauder right through the stomach. He knew that each body slain was earning him a longer sentence in Cold Bath, whether it was out of self-defense or not. He couldn't dwell on that too long, imagining Kitch's reaction, however. He needed to stay alive. Jumping to his feet, he kicked the impaled body off his new weapon before turning around and clashing with a brawny man that had approached from behind. At this rate, they were as good as dead. He couldn't fend them all off on his own. "Here," he said, handing the gun to Matthias after slicing a gash along the pirate's midsection. "Use this." Somehow, Matthias's horrified eyes widened even further. "I've never used a gun before." "It's simple," he said, swiftly pulling the gun back away from the surgeon to fire point blank into a wide-shouldered man's chest. "Just point and shoot," he added, shoving the gun in the surgeon's arms. "Because that has clearly always worked well for you," Matthias pointed out, fumbling with the weapon. "Minor detail," he hissed, exasperated, using both hands to block a powerful blade swing. The clang from the force at which the blades hit rang in his ears, and he felt the reverberating buzz all the way to his shoulders. Kicking the kneecap of a lanky assailant, he bounded over the collapsed man, leaping forward and slashing out at another before he heard Matthias cry out. Spinning around, he found the surgeon continuing to fumble with the gun as he scampered away from a pirate. With a growl and renewed panic, Benedict lunged toward the man to save the surgeon. The downward stab of the pirate's blade narrowly missed Matthias's leg, pinning his wool trousers to the rigid balloon before the marauder's body collapsed atop the sword, crimson liquid seeping from the wound Benedict slashed in his throat. How many more were there? Where did they keep coming from? He needed out, preferably with Matthias alive, but the surgeon was completely useless at fending off the attackers, and though Benedict had thinned the herd ever so slightly, the odds of success were not in his favor alone. Spotting an opening away from the crowd, he hooked his arm around the crook of the surgeon's elbow and forcefully dragged him away, shoving his shoulder and elbow into a nearby body, causing the recipient of the blow to topple over. A loud gasp escaped Matthias as his pinned pocket tore from the movement. "The infusion!" Benedict's attention fell to the trinket as the surgeon tried to reach for it. Unfortunately, Matthias had drawn the sky pirate's attention to it as well, and they began barreling toward the item. There was no way he'd be able to reach it in time and fend off the attackers. Yanking Matthias a little harder, he continued to drag him to the edge of the balloon, sword extended defensively, wishing for a distraction. Another explosion rocked the nine, causing many to fall to their knees. Benedict stayed upright. He'd managed much worse while drunk. The cannonball wasn't the interference he had in mind, but he'd take any opportunity that he could. Pulling Matthias to his feet, he quickly swiped the gun from his grip, holding him captive against himself with the blade of the sword to his throat and the barrel of the gun at his temple, resulting in a yelp from the surgeon. "One move and I'll kill him," he lied, as the group slowed to a stop and one marauder picked up the trinket, much to the surgeon's dismay. "Then you'll never know how to activate it." Looking particularly proud of himself, the pirate grinned a nasty smile complete with random missing teeth. "We'll take our chances," he said with an amused snicker as he shoved the item into his own pocket. Benedict internally growled at his failed idea. There were 2 more things in mind that had come up on the fly, and he really hoped he didn't need to resort to that last one. "Guess I'll just keep him as my captive," he said nonchalantly as he moved the gun away from Matthias and fired at the pirates. He missed the first shot, what else was new, before a series of clicks alerted him to his weapon being empty. Great. Now he had no choice but to execute the last idea. With a grumble as the wave of pirates bull rushed them, there was no time to mentally prepare for the next move. Dropping the gun, he wrapped his arms around Matthias and lunged backwards, off the airship, without warning. Matthias tensed up in a panic from the fall, but Benedict didn't let go. As random as it seemed, his jump was expertly calculated. The landing, however, well, that was truly concerning for him, as it was bound to be a little rough for the both of them. "Grab onto my waist," he ordered. and the surgeon latched on so tightly Benedict thought he'd be crushed. Allowing his back to fall into one of the sails of the tethered brigantine below them, it temporarily slowed their fall long enough for him to grab at the rigging and effectively cut it with one slash of his sword. "Tuck and roll when I tell you to," he instructed, before being met with Matthias's terrified gaze. "Are you out of your mind?" Matthias snapped. As they swung down toward the middle of the ship, Benedict cast a split-second assessment of the situation. There were 2 bodies aboard that he could immediately see. Tossing his sword like a throwing axe at one of those figures, the blade effectively sliced through the flesh, embedding into the shoulder. "Now!" he bellowed to Matthias, whose eyes were so dilated in terror that Benedict could no longer see the color of the irises through the lights of the fires aboard the 9. Matthias released his death grip and dropped only a few feet onto the deck of the ship. Counting down his aim, Benedict released the rope, landing on the other pirate he could see from above, successfully crushing him beneath his weight from speed and momentum. Tumbling from the inertia, he jumped back up to his feet once he came to a full stop, his vision spinning. Attempting to quickly blink it away, he glanced about, despite the dizziness, to locate the surgeon, and found him flat on his back, rubbing his head. Good, he was still alive. Benedict swiftly made his way over, but not before first raising his fists and getting in a few punches on his oncoming angry victim, blade still embedded in his shoulder. Once Benedict knocked him down, he grabbed the hilt and pulled the bloody blade free. A roar from behind caused him to spin around and slash out at a third man's face, causing the aggressor to crumple with a cry of pain before Benedict stabbed the blade through him. How many bodies did that make now? He'd lost count and preferred to keep it that way for poor Kitch's sake. Finally reaching Matthias, he extended his hand to help the surgeon to his feet. "We need to secure the ship," he started, but noticed the surgeon's gaze was on something else. Turning his attention to the 9, he watched as the enemy clambered down the balloon on their way to the brigantine. Another explosion occurred aboard the rusty airship, and both men shielded themselves from some of the flying debris. Matthias cried out as the airship jerked violently, knocking him to his knees. Benedict's attention returned to the 9 as it dropped toward the ocean, taking the tethered brigantines with it. Benedict rushed for the tethers, cutting the ropes and grappling hooks, releasing them from the doom of the 9. He figured that the other ships might do the same and would eventually come for them. They needed to get the hell out of range. "The infusion!" Matthias was still on his knees, his voice soft, almost fragile in his despair. "They have the infusion." Benedict knew what he'd done, even if, though, what he had overheard, their mission had been to retrieve the infusions, handing over the only survivor could still potentially earn him the reward. Maybe. Hopefully. The most important reason behind his decision to jump, however, was to make good on his promise to Kitch. He knew the risk. "Come on," he urged, trying to get the surgeon out of his daze. "We need to secure the ship, and we need to get out of here." "Where will we go?" Matthias shook his head, still in a state of hopelessness. "They have the infusion. This could spell disaster." "Don't be so dramatic," he interrupted. He didn't have time for this. Marching to the helm, he sincerely hoped that if there was still any pirates on board, they weren't secretly planning a coup down below deck. Gripping one of the mahogany handles, he felt the grooves at the tip, which meant that the rudder was dead straight to the hull. Perfect. Right where he wanted it. Using the brigantine's effortless maneuverability to his advantage, he gave the wheel a hard turn to the right, and the airship followed swiftly and smoothly, all sails but the one he had cut the rigging to, billowing in response. Pushing a lever forward on the console nearby, the mechanics of the infused engine roared to life and thrust the brigantine forward at full speed. "They're following," Matthias warned, as Benedict straightened the wheel. "Damn," he muttered under his breath. "What's your plan?" Plan? All his plans from the night thus far were only a bunch of crazy ideas that were either successful or weren't in keeping them alive. "To lose them." "Obviously. How do we do that?" "I haven't thought that far ahead yet," he replied. "Are you just making all this up as you go?" Matthias asked, incredulous. "Would you shut up and let me think if I said yes?" Benedict hissed through gritted teeth. He felt Matthias's tight-lipped glare before the surgeon turned and headed below deck. Irritation melting in the silence, Benedict could finally concentrate. His gaze traveled up to the masts and sails in the darkness, to what little he could see of the system of ropes, cables, and chains, then followed the shrouds down to the main deck before him. Perhaps his great last resort idea wasn't that great after all. Sure, the initial point was to get away from the pirates, but what he didn't consider was that he was on a ship that required a minimum of 30 people to properly sail, and he was, unfortunately, only one person. Matthias reemerged and made his way to the bodies on deck, checking for a pulse before dragging and shoving the corpses overboard. Benedict could do nothing but watch the surgeon between dancing shadows cast from the lanterns. The adrenaline must have been wearing off because he was starting to feel that sting of each cut received in battle, the stiffness of his protesting muscles, and the sharp stab and viscous sensation of something on the soles of his feet. He remembered inconveniently being barefoot when the windows in the captain's cabin shattered during the attack. The pain was really getting to him now. Dropping his attention to his feet, he realized the wet and sticky consistency was a small puddle of blood. Following the trail of crimson footprints with his eyes until they disappeared in the darkness, he noticed them also scattered along the deck and wondered who the blood really belonged to. He'd have to check out the damage in the morning. Taking a step back, he almost cried out in agony when his leg gave out, dropping him down to one knee. His entire body refused to cooperate as he tried to get back up, the shooting pain making him nauseous. Gulping for air, his head suddenly started spinning. "The ship is secured," he heard Matthias say before gasping. Benedict fell forward, losing all control of his body. It refused to listen. He felt himself collapse into Matthias before he lost consciousness.
And the story
end.
will continue. Oh my gosh, so much fun. When you were writing, I'm particularly interested, for some reason, I'm really drawn to Matthias. There's just something about his character when I was reading this. I just really, really liked him. So is there anybody in particular that you patterned Matthias after in real life?
I didn't. I
He just kind of emerged on his own?
He did. He actually was originally in the Techno Mage in one of the chapters. It broke my heart to cut him out because he just didn't fit. He really had no point in the Techno Mage. But I kind of figured, you know what, if I cut him out of the Techno Mage, I bet he will, reemerge somewhere else. And sure enough, he did.
And he's a pretty heavy character in this book.
He is.
Yeah.
He is. He definitely plays a bigger role than he did in the Techno Mage, which was just to bandage up Captain Keenan because he got hurt.
Right. I just love this. The other question I wanted to ask you about this, and we'll probably talk about it when you come back to read Techno Mage, but how much research did you have to do into simultaneously the time period? Because this is all supposed to be
Victorian
era stuff, right?
Yes.
So how much did you have to research that time period in juxtaposition with all of the like story ideas that are in your present day head? Like, how did you have to reconcile that?
I had to do so much research, not just on Victorian era, like what they ate, what jobs they had, the type of clothing they wore, like what their clothes were made out of. Not only that, but I also had to, like, what year was the Victorian era, and during those years, what was happening elsewhere? Because, like I said, he was on his way to Canada.
Right.
And most of the novel takes place around the Great Lakes.
Yes. Yeah.
So I also had to research, was Canada, like, prior to becoming a country, what was Canada called at that point? And which provinces were in existence and which ones weren't, and what were the city called near the
I think that's super fun that you're a Canadian native and you still had to look that stuff up. That makes me feel a little bit better about my American history class in high school that I didn't get a lot out of. So I feel a little bit better about that you like had a similar Canadian history class in high school.
Yes, we did, and I will admit to, I really didn't care back then.
Yeah.
And now, while I was doing my research, I was like, yeah, I should have known that. I should have known that.
But it's really fun too that when most people think Victorian age, they think Europe.
Yes.
So it's neat that you put this here in our home,
Yes.
which is a little bit different.
And I mean, like in the beginning, it takes place in London because that's where Keenan's from.
Right.
But I did manage to like put it a little bit everywhere because I mean, if you're going to be riding airships, why not,
Right.
go around the world? The Techno Mage actually mostly takes place in Germany.
Mhm.
And um so Rise of the Sky Pirate takes place around the Great Lakes, but focuses on where Matthias is actually from, which is Elgin. I can't even remember the proper pronunciation of it, but it's a city on the Canadian side of the falls.
Okay. Very cool. Wow. I am so glad that you came out to read for us today. I always enjoy talking to you, and I'm so excited to be able to share your work with our listeners because I just think that your writing is just so addictive. I mean,
Thank you.
seriously, I'm addicted. So I appreciate you. Thank you very much for coming out.
Thanks so much for having me.
Sure. Come back again, please.
Absolutely.
Lots. Have a great day.
You too.